Hi, welcome to Nightingale Tarot. Today we're going to travel through the timeline, the much debated timeline of the history of tarot as we know it today. Let's get started, shall we? Okay. I have a lot of notes here in front of me because this is a lot of dates and information, and I want to make sure I'm presenting it correctly. All right, so let's go way back to the very beginning. First, let me say that everybody wants to claim that they're the ones with the origin of tarot. The Italians want to claim it, the French want to claim it, some people say it's Egyptian. Let's start at the beginning. Around 1350, 1356, we can trace to Italy a game called Trifoni. Trifoni. Now, what is Trifoni? It is a card game that originated in the Visconti court in Milan, Italy. And that card game included allegorical figures who had to defeat the previous allegorical figure in order to progress through their hero's journey. Now, this corresponds directly with the 22 major arcana cards in the tarot deck as we know it today. Let me back up and say, when I say tarot and the history of tarot, I'm not talking about oracle decks. I'm not talking about angel decks. I'm not talking about any of that. I am talking about traditional tarot, 22 major arcana cards, 56 minor arcana cards, including the court cards. That's tarot when I'm talking about tarot for the purposes of this video. And really, that's the true definition of tarot. So that's what we're working with. And we'll talk some more about that later. Anyway, 22 allegorical figures that had to progress through this hero's journey. And in order to do that, they had to defeat the allegorical figure before them. And they moved through this journey. Okay, 1356. Now we're going to move into 1370. And in 1370, we have the introduction of playing cards, more like the playing cards you know today, like poker or, whatever, spades, playing cards like that. Also known as napes. And this is when we introduce the suits into the picture. Coming through Italian and Spanish ports, the Italian suits, swords, wands or batons, cups, and coins that correspond with the American suits of diamonds, clubs, hearts, and spades. And these also included the court cards, king, queen, knight, and at the time, valet, more commonly known as page in today's tarot decks. So you have these two separate decks that then combined around between 1370 and 1400 or so, combined to make one big deck known as the beginning of the big combined 78 card tarot deck as we know it today, where we have the major arcana and the minor arcana all coming together. So what this actually was is that first Trifoni deck with those archetypes, those allegorical figures, combined with the playing cards that came through Spanish and Italian ports to be one large deck. And that later became tarot as we know it. Now, in the early 1400s, we have numerous written references to these cards, also known as the napes, and also ordinances against them due to their involvement in gambling. So we know that this sort of Trifoni deck in combination with these playing card napes were still around in the 1400s. Now, right around that same time, a deck of playing cards made their way to the National Library of France. And those cards are known as the Charles VI deck. They were mistakenly called a tarot deck, but they're actually not a tarot deck. They're more like those playing cards without the major arcana, those 22 original cards thrown in there. But at any rate, made it to the National Library of France. This was the first use of the term tarot instead of Trifoni or napes or playing cards or any of those other terms. We see in 1440 that there's a journal entry that they trace back that actually references this word tarot in association with a deck known as the Carta di Trifoni. It's got that original word Trifoni in it. In 1440 is the first time we see that in writing. Now, in 1441, Francesco Sforza, who later goes on to become the Duke of Milan, marries Bianca Visconti. Why is that important? I'll tell you why. Because he commissioned a deck, one of these combined decks, Trifoni plus playing card decks that we call tarot decks now. He commissioned this as a wedding gift and referred to it as a tarot deck. And from that point on, that particular type of deck became very popular with Italian nobility and through the Italian, court life. And a game was developed specifically with this combined deck known as tarocchi. 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 Teriyaki. Tarocchi. Tarokai. No, it's tarocchi. Tarocchi, if you're Italian. So this deck we know existed and was important because there are numerous references to it in literature. There are even some frescoes in Italy that include people sitting around with this deck. So what was this? 1480s or so through the 1510s, this deck enjoyed huge popularity as a game, playing cards, tarocchi. And the rules of the game were different depending on who you asked, but the main premise was you used the deck, shuffled it, drew a card in order to get the answer to a question. That sounds a lot like tarot, doesn't it? Yeah, that's when we really start to see it develop into that. So here's this deck, the tarocchi, where you pick random cards. You use them to answer questions. I'm not sure exactly how that worked for them at the time, but we know that that's how it was. 1550-ish is when we start to see lots of these decks, woodblock decks, paper when that became a thing and people could print on paper. All this combination Trifoni decks with these tarocchi decks, and those look a lot like tarot decks that we see today. So in 1557, there was a woodblock deck made that still exists. You can still see this deck printed on woodblocks, and it looks a lot like modern day tarot. So moving forward, 1730 through 1830, that 100-year period is when we started to see a standardized set of rules for the game tarocchi. And at that time, we also see the development of a particular very well-known tarot deck called the Tarot of Marseille, which looks like this. So 1861, we're moving forward a little bit. 1861, we have Kenneth Mackenzie, who was an English occultist. Wrote a very important piece of literature called the Cipher Manuscript and Book of Tarot. And this really became the basis for Anglo-American tarot. So now we're moving out of this game in Italian courts, and we're expanding this out to more mainstream to include fortune telling and divination and other occult uses of this deck. 1863, we have this dude named Paul Christian come in who claims, no, you have this all wrong. There are Egyptian meanings to these cards. That's where this comes from. It's Egyptian. So he wrote this book about the Egyptian meaning of cards. And this is the first time we saw the use of the word arcana. And we still use that today. Major arcana and minor arcana are the two big groups of tarot cards that form that full 78 card deck together. And that's 1863 is the first time we have recorded use of that word arcana. In 1864, we have the publishing of a piece of literature called the Book of Days, which were card reading techniques specifically used by soldiers' wives in the day. And at that time, we start to get the meanings and interpretations for specific cards that we still have in use today. Matter of fact, most of the standardly accepted tarot interpretations for the minor arcana actually can be traced back to 1864 in the Book of Days. In 1896, we have the development of the first Egyptian-based deck that was published, and it looks something like this. And then moving forward a little more, in 1909, that's when we get the big, here's how it's going to be tarot that we use as the gold standard for which essentially all other decks were developed for a long time. That is the Rider-Waite deck and its accompanying book, which still today holds as the gold standard for base tarot interpretations and meanings of cards. And it looks like this. And that really maintained its reputation as being the way. So from 1909, when the Rider-Waite was initially published, through 1970, there was really no other type of deck other than just baseline Rider-Waite. Then Aleister Crowley came out and he had this book and these paintings, and there was this deck based on these paintings, and it was a little different but still really maintained that symbolism. And then all the way up until maybe 4 or 5 years later, 1974, 1975, is when we started to get the real breakaway imagery. And we started to get tons of decks where people had their own interpretation of what each card was, the colors that should be associated. We started renaming some of the suits from discs to pinnacles to stones to all this different stuff. And you can see here the wide array of some of the types of decks that came out of this. And then in 1997, we get the first World Tarot Congress held in Chicago. And that brings us really up into the modern age of tarot and tarot decks. So you have this kind of questionable origin of this card game in Italy. Then we move into, like, was it the Egyptians? Was it the French come up with it? What about this deck? What about that deck in the French library? Well, that's not really a tarot deck, even though they're claiming that's the origin, and we have these wood blocks and these cards. But really, if you want to look at the beginning point of modern tarot symbolism, the baseline with which all Anglo-American tarot is traced back to, you're looking at 1909 with the Rider-Waite deck, which is still the gold standard. Most of the decks that come out very, even if it's loosely, very much tie back to the symbolism in that deck and the interpretations of that deck. Unless you get into oracle decks and angel decks and those other things, but those are not tarot decks, so we don't count those here. Yeah, so that's the history, the much disputed, sometimes argued about, sometimes angrily argued about, history of tarot as we know it today. Thanks so much for stopping by. I hope you learned something today. And even if you didn't, thanks so much for stopping by anyway. In my next video, my plan is to start comparing decks, to look at some of these different decks and see what this card looks like across 5 or 6 different decks. And I'll be using my decks to show you pictures to compare so we can learn about tarot symbolism and how it's evolved since that 1909 Rider-Waite original deck. I hope to see you then.